Alexander Grant's oceanfront estate in the Hamptons sat on a high dune facing the Atlantic, all glass walls and clean lines reflecting the slate-blue sky and the glittering water beyond. Everything here spoke of precision and control. A lawn trimmed to mirror flatness, olive trees in perfect rows, a gravel path so quiet you could hear your own footsteps. Yet inside that perfection lived something hard to name, an absence of breath, as if the house were holding itself still, waiting for something that had never arrived. Alexander Grant, 40, is the CEO of Grant Systems, a leading American tech conglomerate with tens of thousands of employees and deals that make Wall Street take notice. He is known for decisiveness, for a boardroom chill, for a calendar planned down to the minute. 3 years ago, his wife died in a helicopter crash on her way back from a short business trip. Since then, Alexander has thrown himself into work the way a person grabs for a life ring in rough seas. Cross-time zone meetings, midnight signings, 3 continents in a week. Success kept piling up, but the house's glass grew so transparent it exposed an uncomfortable truth. His life was missing a child's laughter. Ethan Grant, 5, has deep brown eyes that linger at the window longer than necessary. He speaks little, polite in an old-fashioned way, as if he has understood too soon the things adults don't want to explain. After his mother's death, Ethan moved through schedules perfectly arranged by assistants and tutors, piano on Mondays, French on Wednesdays, swimming on Fridays. He did everything and almost never smiled. Nannies came and went, not for lack of skill, but because none of them could reach the place where a child keeps his sadness. Alexander believed discipline could fill the gap. He set standards, requested reports, arranged everything like a high-pressure project. But at night, as the glass rooms went dark one by one, he would stand in the long hallway and look toward his son's door, wondering if he had been heading the wrong way from the start. He could repair an overloaded data architecture in 48 hours, but he had no idea how to mend a small heart that was closing. Sophie Miller, 29, entered the story from a different turn. She had been a preschool teacher at a small school in Brooklyn, a place of paint-splattered walls, off-key songs, and muddy shoes tucked into a corner. The school closed after a funding cut. Sophie lost her job, but not the habit of kneeling to a child's eye level to listen. She volunteered at a community center, helping kids plant seeds, whisk cocoa, and tell stories in silly voices. On paper, there were degrees, experience, glowing references. What people remembered, though, was the warmth in her eyes and the way she waited for a child to answer on their own rhythm. A high-end staffing firm called Sophie with a proposal, a private nanny position for Ethan Grant in the Hamptons. They spoke of an enviable salary, a schedule supported by an entire team, safety and flawless standards. Sophie listened, nodded, and asked a single question. What does Ethan like most when no one tells him what he should like? The line went quiet for a few seconds. Then the liaison gave a sheepish laugh and said they'd get back to her with that answer. The next afternoon, Sophie arrived at the estate. The sky was clear, the sea breeze carried salt, and the resin-sweet scent of pines that bordered the drive. She stood before a tall wooden door and knew she was about to enter a house designed to control every variable, except the ones that mattered most. On the other side of that door, Alexander checked his phone's meeting grid, tapping a time slot as if he could move time itself. And Ethan, in a second-floor room, stacked wooden blocks into a small bridge, hoping someone would finally cross. The heavy wooden door swung open, and an elderly butler invited Sophie into the grand foyer. The space inside was both overwhelming in its scale and so still that the metallic tick of an antique clock could be heard clearly. Afternoon light streamed through the glass walls, drawing long, gold-edged shadows across the polished stone floor. Alexander Grant appeared at the top of the staircase, his charcoal gray suit tailored to broad shoulders, His tie knotted with the precision of someone who believed every thread should be in its place. He descended with the presence of a man accustomed to commanding a room without speaking. His gaze swept over Sophie, not cold, but held at a careful distance, the way one might assess a potential deal. "Thank you for coming, Miss Miller," he said, his voice low and measured, each word placed like a period at the end of a sentence. Sophie smiled, shook his hand, feeling the firmness there, but noting he didn't squeeze to assert dominance. She followed him down a long hallway into a wide study lined with books, its windows framing the sea. Alexander sat behind a walnut desk and gestured for her to take the chair opposite. The interview began with familiar questions: experience, certifications, emergency handling, daily structure. Sophie answered concisely. But when Alexander asked about her approach to managing a child's time, she tilted her head slightly and replied, "I don't think children should be managed like a project. I think they need to be listened to first." His brows drew together as if the answer had stepped off the grid he'd prepared. "But here we have a very specific schedule," he said, resting his hand on a stack of papers. "I want to make sure there are no empty spaces." "Empty spaces," Sophie echoed, her eyes drifting toward the window. "Sometimes that's exactly where a child breathes." There was a brief silence, filled only by the faraway crash of waves. Alexander studied her a moment longer before turning to the next question. At last, he set the file aside. "I think you should meet Ethan." They walked down another corridor and into a second-floor room. Ethan sat on the rug, a small castle of wooden blocks in front of him. He looked up at the sound of the door, his deep brown eyes wide and quiet. "Ethan, this is Miss Sophie," Alexander introduced. The boy gave a small nod, then bent back to his blocks. Sophie didn't approach right away. She lowered herself to the floor a short distance away, picked a block from the basket beside her, and began building a small bridge. No barrage of questions, no overly bright "hello," just the soft click of wood fitting together and the faint wash of waves from outside. After a few minutes, Ethan glanced over. Sophie gave him a gentle smile and slid a block toward him like an invitation. He hesitated, then added it to her bridge. Alexander stood in the doorway, saying nothing. Watching them, he realized he couldn't remember the last time Ethan had willingly reached out to someone. When Sophie left the estate that afternoon, Alexander walked her all the way to the gate. His parting line about getting back to her after the interview was spoken like routine, but there was something in his eyes, a glint absent from any of his usual hiring processes. The evening after Sophie left, Alexander sat in his study, her file resting beside a thick stack of contracts. He opened it again, scanning the certificates and glowing letters of reference, but the printed words kept bringing back the image of that afternoon. A woman patiently sitting on the floor, waiting for his son to come to her on his own. Every nanny before had been skilled, but they approached Ethan as if completing an assignment. Sophie? She hadn't tried to seize his attention, she'd simply left space for him to choose. And that, Alexander knew, was rare. The next morning, he called the staffing agency. "Hire her. Start Monday." When Sophie received the call, her voice held a note of surprise, but she calmly accepted. She arrived on the first day of the week, shown through the rooms, introduced to the household staff, and handed the meticulous schedule broken down to the minute. Alexander passed her the printout, his tone firm. "I want everything to go exactly as it says here." Sophie took it, nodding, but her eyes quietly followed Ethan at the breakfast table, legs swinging, gaze fixed on his cereal bowl. In the first days, she didn't break the schedule. She just found rare pockets of time, a few minutes before piano, 15 minutes after lunch. In those spaces, she coaxed Ethan into the yard to kick a ball, paint, or read together. The boy spoke little, but began to give her longer glances, sometimes even a short reply. On a Saturday morning, Sophie appeared at Ethan's doorway with a surprise: a blue inflatable pool, some water toys, and a bag of bubble wands. "How about we try a water day?" she said, holding the pool aloft. Ethan looked up, eyes wide, then dashed off for his swim trunks. That afternoon, the sun was gentle, the sea breeze drifting into the backyard. Together, Sophie and Ethan inflated the pool, filled it with warm water, and dropped in a few rubber ducks. The boy sat down, splashing his hands until droplets flew. Sophie took up the hose, spraying a delicate arc that glittered in the sunlight. Laughter rang out, clear, round, as if it had been asleep inside him for far too long. Alexander came home early that day. Passing the hall toward the yard, he heard that laughter and stopped. Stepping to the glass doors, he stood behind the sheer curtain. Before him was Ethan, drenched, hair plastered to his forehead, amber eyes bright, laughing as Sophie splashed him. She was soaked too, hair loose, sunlight catching droplets on her skin until they shimmered. Ethan brandished a rubber duck in mock attack. Sophie shrieked in pretend fear, ducked behind the pool's edge, then countered with a sudden spray from the hose. The boy threw his head back, laughing, small hands flinging water everywhere. Alexander felt his chest tighten, not in anger, but in the awareness that he was seeing something he'd been missing for too long: his son's pure joy. He didn't step in. Only when Sophie wrapped Ethan in a towel, teasing, "Looks like we turned the backyard into the ocean," did he turn away. But the image stayed with him until that night. At dinner, Ethan recounted the water games, his eyes alight. Alexander listened, and for the first time in months, his smile came without effort. In the days after Water Day, Alexander began paying closer attention to how Sophie interacted with Ethan. There were no commands, no lists of should and must, only gentle questions, subtle praise when Ethan managed something on his own. The boy began seeking her out, not just during playtime, but whenever he needed someone to listen to a long story about a crab on the beach or an idea for a drawing. One evening, Alexander came home early to find Sophie and Ethan on the living room floor, piecing together a wooden jigsaw of the world. The boy pointed to Africa, asking innocent questions about animals. Sophie answered with small stories, laced with humor, making Ethan giggle. Alexander stood in the doorway, not stepping in, just letting the sound of that laughter fill the air. That night at dinner, Alexander invited Sophie to join them at the table, a gesture he'd never extended to any previous nanny. The table was set with grilled salmon and fresh salad. At first, the conversation revolved around Ethan, new interests, sleeping patterns, how he reacted to new situations. "Do you have a way to make Ethan more open?" Alexander asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and seriousness. Sophie set down her fork and met his eyes. "Children need to feel loved before they can be taught. When they know they're safe and heard, they open up on their own." Alexander was silent for a moment. It wasn't the answer he'd expected. He'd thought she might give him a concrete strategy, a list of timed activities. Instead, she spoke of feelings, something he'd never prioritized. As dinner wound down, Ethan ran upstairs to fetch his stuffed bear. Alexander and Sophie remained, the pace slower, softer. He looked out the window, where the ocean stretched under the moonlight, and said quietly, "I didn't think I had to learn how to be a father. I thought providing everything was enough." Sophie didn't interrupt. He drew a breath and continued. 3 years ago, my wife died. Helicopter crash. Ethan was only 2. I thought, if I worked harder, succeeded more, it would make up for it. But the more I achieved, the further I drifted from him." She looked at him, her eyes free of judgment, offering only a calm presence. "Maybe," Sophie said softly, "what Ethan needs isn't a perfect father, but a real one." Alexander looked up and their eyes met. In that moment, he realized she wasn't just caring for his son. She was changing the way he saw himself. One night, toward the end of the month, the wind off the ocean carried a damp chill, and Ethan began to cough lightly. Sophie noticed immediately that he was more tired than usual, eyes slightly red, cheeks flushed, steps slower. She checked his temperature, 100 on 1.3 degree. Alexander had just wrapped up a video conference when he heard Sophie's quiet call from the hallway. Seeing the thermometer, his brows drew together at once. "We need to call a doctor right now," he said, his tone quick and firm, like delivering a business decision. "No need to panic," Sophie replied, her voice gentle yet steady. "I've seen this many times. Ethan just needs rest and to bring the fever down." Alexander wasn't used to being contradicted in his own home, but the calm in Sophie's eyes made him pause. They guided Ethan back to his room. Sophie placed a cool cloth on his forehead, prepared a small bowl of clear chicken soup. Alexander stood nearby, awkwardly holding the bowl, asking again and again, "Should we take him to the hospital? Call an ambulance?" Sophie smiled, guiding him through how to sponge Ethan down to lower the fever. The boy lay in the center of the bed, his hand wrapped around Sophie's, eyes half closed. Alexander sat on the other side, and for the first time in a long while, his mind wasn't on emails or reports, only on the rhythm of his son's breathing. As night fell deeper, Sophie suggested he get some rest, but Alexander shook his head. They took turns checking the temperature every half hour, changing the cloth when it warmed. Sometimes, when Sophie smiled at Ethan, Alexander realized he was smiling too, a small, genuine smile that didn't feel forced. Around 4 in the morning, Ethan's temperature dropped to 98.6 degrees. He slept peacefully, breathing evenly. Sophie stood to leave, but Alexander caught her hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without you here tonight." Sophie smiled, easing her hand free, but their eyes met longer than usual. Alexander felt something strange. In 3 years, he had sat in negotiation rooms worth billions, but had never felt as reassured as he did here, in this warm bedroom, beside his son and this woman. The next morning, Ethan woke looking better, offering a faint but warm smile to find both Sophie and Alexander there. From that night on, Alexander began to change. He deliberately cut unnecessary meetings, came home earlier, not just to check in as before, but to truly be present. He joined Sophie in taking Ethan for walks along the beach, helping him build sandcastles, and reading together before bed. Every time he heard Ethan laughing freely beside Sophie, Alexander knew that fevered night had turned everything, both for his son and for himself. Since the night Ethan was sick, Alexander began to shift his pace of life. He no longer stayed at the office until late, nor accepted every international conference call in the evening. Instead, he came home earlier, often while the sun was still above the horizon. Afternoons at the estate began to sound different. Ethan's laughter ringing across the lawn, Sophie calling him in for dinner, the ocean's rhythm mixing with the roll of bike tires on the gravel path. At first, Alexander only watched from a distance, but Sophie skillfully drew him into their games. Together with Ethan, they built a fabric tent in the living room, filling it with pillows and blankets, reading stories under flashlight beams. On other days, they walked to the nearby beach with a picnic basket Sophie had prepared. Ethan ran barefoot on wet sand, while Sophie and Alexander walked slower, sharing pieces of their own childhoods. Ethan gradually began calling her Mama Sophie without thinking. The first time Alexander heard it, he glanced over in surprise, but Sophie simply smiled, not correcting the boy. In Ethan's mind, it seemed natural, as though she had filled that space long ago. One evening, after Ethan had gone to bed, Sophie stepped onto the balcony to fold towels she'd brought in from the line. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and the sound of waves. Alexander joined her, carrying 2 mugs of hot tea. "I've never just sat still like this," he said, handing her one. Sophie laughed softly. Maybe you should do it more often. They sat side by side, speaking little, just listening to the sea. Then Alexander began to share about long business trips, the feeling of walking into luxurious hotel rooms that were empty, and realizing he had no one to share the day's triumphs or disappointments with. Sophie listened quietly, nodding now and then. When she lifted her cup to her lips, their hands brushed. Neither moved away quickly. The touch was light but distinct, like a reminder that something was growing between them, something neither dared to name, but both could feel. In early December, as the pine trees lining the drive to the estate began to show a few strands of Christmas lights, Alexander received a call from his law office. A longtime partner reported that a London-based global conglomerate wanted to acquire Grant Systems for $15 billion. It would be the largest tech deal of the year, and it came with a condition. Alexander would need to relocate to London for at least 4 years to personally oversee the merger. The news swept into his quiet study like a cold wind. On paper, it was the perfect opportunity. The company's value doubled, his name etched into industry history. But the moment he set the phone down, a weight settled in his chest. 4 years meant leaving behind afternoons at the beach, the sound of Ethan's laughter in the yard, and Sophie. That night, after Ethan had gone to bed, Alexander found Sophie in the kitchen, washing glasses. "I got an offer," he began, his voice slow and low. $15 billion with a move to London for 4 years. Sophie looked up, her hands still wet, a flicker of surprise passing before her expression settled into calm. "And what are you thinking?" "I don't know, career-wise. It's the peak. But I also know 4 years is a long time for Ethan. And for—" He stopped, as if afraid to say too much. She set the glass down and dried her hands. "I can't decide for you, but I do know Ethan doesn't count the numbers on a contract. He only counts the dinners you're here for." In the days that followed, Alexander lived in a state of suspension. Every time he saw Sophie and Ethan planting in the garden or baking in the kitchen, he asked himself if he could walk away from it. By day, he sat in board meetings, hearing the arguments for the massive profit. By night, he stood on the balcony, listening to the waves, thinking about Sophie's answer. The next day, while Alexander was in a video conference, Ethan knocked on the office door, clutching his worn teddy bear. "Dad, Sophie will come with us if we move to London, right?" The boy's voice was so fragile it seemed to carry the weight of all his unspoken fears. Alexander turned slowly, as if afraid that moving too quickly might break the moment. "Why do you ask that?" Ethan's eyes stayed on the worn teddy bear in his hands. "Because I don't want to lose Sophie. Mom's gone. And if Sophie goes too, I don't think I can be happy again." The words struck like a blade. Images from the past 3 years flashed through Alexander's mind. Empty seats at the dinner table, nights when Ethan's eyes still glistened as he fell asleep, and the days Alexander had missed every small moment because he was somewhere else. After Ethan left, Alexander sat frozen, hands gripping the chair arms. Outside the glass, the ocean rolled under the fading light, but inside him, another tide was rising, a battle between ambition and love. The next day, the board pressed harder, the number 15 billion repeating like a drumbeat. But each night, when he saw Sophie and Ethan baking together, their laughter filling the kitchen, Alexander asked himself, could he give this up for a place in business history? One evening, as the three of them made pizza, flour scattered across the counter, Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on Sophie as if afraid she might vanish if he blinked. Alexander set down his spoon. "Maybe. I found something worth more than any deal." Sophie looked up, their eyes meeting, and she didn't need to ask. She knew exactly what he meant. 3 weeks after receiving the offer, the number 15 billion still sat on Alexander's desk like a heavy stone pressing on every thought. Each day brought a flood of calls from the board, shareholders, and partners, all repeating the same line. This is the opportunity of your life. The financial press began running features, his name under headlines lined with gold. On paper, it was glory. But every time he opened his laptop, instead of focusing on profit charts, his mind filled with images of Ethan running barefoot across the lawn, hair streaming in the wind, and Sophie standing on the porch, sunlight wrapping around her smile. On Christmas Eve, the estate glowed under 1,000 lights. In the living room, the tree was decorated by Ethan and Sophie, its string of lights slightly uneven. Some ornaments hung too low, but beautiful in a way no interior designer could replicate. It had a soul. After Ethan went to bed, Alexander stepped into the kitchen. Sophie sat at the table, leaning over to wrap the last of the presents. The warm overhead light caught in her hair, turning the moment into something Alexander wished he could keep forever. He stood there for several seconds, watching until Sophie looked up. "How long have you been standing there?" she smiled. "Long enough to know I don't want to lose this moment." Alexander came closer, taking the seat across from her. He drew a slow breath. "Sophie, I've made my decision." She paused, her eyes glistening. "A decision? I'm going to turn it down." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Even the crackle of the fire seemed to fade, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "Are you sure?" Sophie's voice was quiet, but her eyes searched his, almost afraid to believe it. "More sure than anything I've ever decided," he said, his voice steady but warm. "For years, I thought my dream was to stand at the peak of my career. But the truth is, the peak is nothing without someone to share the view with. My dream now is to come home every night to you and Ethan, to hear his laughter, and to see this smile." He brushed her cheek gently. "Before I close my eyes." Sophie gave a small laugh, but the corners of her eyes shimmered. "Alexander, this is your whole career." "No, Sophie, a career is only part of my life, but you two, you're all of it?" The words seemed to still the air. Sophie lowered her gaze, pretending to rearrange the wrapping paper to hide the shine in her eyes. But Alexander moved around the table to sit beside her. "You've done something no one else could," he said, voice deepening. "You haven't just saved Ethan. You've saved me." Sophie looked up, and in that moment, Alexander leaned in, his lips meeting hers. The kiss wasn't rushed or fierce. It was slow, warm and steady, like finding the home both had been searching for all these years. When they parted, Sophie rested her forehead against his, whispering, "We're already a family, Alexander." He tightened his hold on her hand, and this time he knew for certain, no number, no deal, would ever be worth trading this away. The following spring, as the waves in the Hamptons began to mirror the soft morning light, and the breeze carried the scent of salt mixed with the fragrance of coastal flowers, Alexander decided it was time to turn what he'd been holding in his heart into reality. One afternoon, while Sophie was out, he sat on the balcony with Ethan, who was busy drawing a family picture, the three of them holding hands on the beach under a star-filled sky. Looking at the drawing, Alexander felt his heart soften. He leaned down and asked quietly, "Ethan, would you like to help me propose to Sophie?" The boy's eyes lit up, and with a rare seriousness for his age, he replied, "But I get to carry the ring, right?" Alexander smiled and nodded. "Not just carry it. You'll be my partner in crime." A few days later, he invited Sophie to the beach in front of the estate, telling her he wanted to watch the sunset with her and Ethan. As the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in rich gold and orange, Ethan ran over and handed Sophie an envelope. Inside was the family drawing he had made, along with a card in strong yet heartfelt handwriting. "You are the final piece that completes our home. Will you marry me?" When she looked up, She saw Alexander kneeling on one knee in the sand, the small blue velvet box in his hand, his eyes shining as though they held both the sunset and the ocean. "Sophie Miller, you've brought sunlight back into Ethan's world, and you've taught me that happiness isn't measured in numbers, but in moments like this. You've given me back my smile, my home, my heart. Will you marry me?" Tears welled before her answer escaped. "Yes, Alexander, yes." He rose, pulling her into his arms, while Ethan danced around them, shouting, "I have a mom now!" The wedding took place on a warm summer afternoon, right on the Hamptons shore. White chairs lined the aisle, strewn with baby's breath and seashells. The soft sound of waves blended with the strum of an acoustic guitar. Sophie walked forward in a pristine white gown, her smile brighter than the sun itself. Ethan, in his tiny suit, proudly carried the ring box, and when he reached the front, he whispered to his father, "Keep Sophie forever, Dad." Alexander squeezed his son's hand, then slipped the ring onto the woman he knew would be home for both of them. After the ceremony, their life together wasn't just complete. It was full of joy. Sophie opened a small class for local children, where every wall was filled with drawings and laughter. Alexander arranged his work so he could come home every evening to share dinner with his family. Ethan became a wonderful big brother when, the following spring, they welcomed baby Emma, a little girl with bright eyes and a smile uncannily like Sophie's. One summer evening, as the family sat on the balcony overlooking the sea, Ethan cradled Emma in his arms, Sophie leaned against Alexander's shoulder, and the golden sunset stretched across the waves. The children's laughter floated in the breeze. Alexander gently took Sophie's hand and whispered, "I once thought $15 billion was an opportunity I couldn't miss, but now I know the thing I couldn't miss was you." Sophie smiled, her eyes glistening with the reflection of the evening light. And in that moment, they both knew they had found life's greatest treasure, a family, an eternal love, where the sound of waves and the beating of hearts blended into one, forever. Some decisions seem like just a choice, but in truth, they are the turns that shape destiny. The day Alexander walked away from $15 billion, he didn't just abandon a deal. He opened the door that led him back to where he truly belonged, the arms of the woman he loved and the laughter of the children who called him family. The oceanfront villa still stood there, the waves still kissed the shore each morning, but inside it was no longer the cold walls of success. It was the warmth of the kitchen, the sound of small footsteps racing down the hall, the dinners where every gaze found its way to the people who mattered most. Life isn't measured by numbers, but by the moments we cannot bear to lose. And sometimes the most precious thing comes when we dare to let go of what we once thought was everything. Because in the end, Alexander understood. True wealth isn't counted in dollars or signed on contracts. It's the warmth of a hand you never want to let go, the sound of laughter that fills a once silent house, and the love that stays long after the waves beyond the shore have fallen silent.